Hello, I'm Jack Brewer with Expanding Frontiers Research. I'm joined today by Vanessa Walilko. Vanessa, while earning her bachelor's in science and sociology at the University of DePaul, worked on the Cook County, Chicago domestic violence assessment. She has spoken with us before about related issues, and I'm happy to welcome her back. Thanks for being here today, Vanessa.
Thanks for having me again.
Sure. Investigative reporter at Fox 13 Utah, Nate Carlisle, has been doing a series of reports on a domestic violence case involving Christian J. Marx and Erica Lukes, the executive director of Expanding Frontiers. In his most recent video, Mr. Carlisle explored what has been happening with this ongoing case. He found a Utah judicial system bogged down in paralysis, law enforcement lack of action, and even a lack of willingness or ability to take action by the Utah National Guard, which employs Mr. Marx. What are we seeing in cases like this, Vanessa, and what is going on with domestic violence in America?
So when we're looking at cases like this and similar cases, we're looking at systemic issues, right? We can't just see this as an isolated incident. This is happening all over the country. It has been since I started doing domestic violence 20 years ago and before that. That's even how domestic violence got into the political realm, because suddenly in the 70s, women started talking to each other about what their individual experiences were. And they realized it's not just me in my home getting hit. This is happening to women all over the country. And nobody's doing anything about it. Nobody thinks it's a problem. It's getting minimized. It's getting denied. It's people are suffering in silence. And so unfortunately, you have these systems that are built to protect people of a certain place in the social hierarchy and to ignore anybody underneath, right? So if you look at men, white men, specifically men also who are connected either to law enforcement or to military, or in some cases to mayors, to governors, they have a certain amount of privilege, they have a certain amount of protection, and police agencies are disinclined to act, even in cases where men aren't connected, where the perpetrators aren't connected. The police agencies have been historically unwilling to act. And again, my background is in social theory and feminist theory. You have to look at, again, structures. Who gets the grace of being seen as a human being and who doesn't? So often when police are called to the scene of a domestic violence incident, you'll typically have the victim who is crying, shaky, not really able to communicate because, and again, I'm talking about heterosexual relationships, like a woman who has been abused and has been hit and she's traumatized. And then the perpetrator, he's cool as a cucumber. He's totally fine, even keel. He can speak, clearly communicate to the police officers. Maybe he's friends with one of them. It just got blown out of proportion. She yells, somebody heard something. Again, everything is easily explained away. Again, if you also get into the personality of a perpetrator of domestic violence, they're very targeted with who they are abusing. And they are very controlled in their behavior when it matters to people they could actually have consequences with. So they know how to present themselves to police in such a way that, like, oh no, it's just all blown out of proportion. And again, despite all the changes we've had in society in the past several decades, a lot of people still see women as hysterical, as blowing things out of proportion, as too emotional, that, oh, she just, we got into it, but it's not that big of a deal. And so if we don't even see women as people or as worthy of, again, protection, or if it's their own fault, that's another narrative that kind of controls a lot of these things. Police are disinclined to act, right? Again, I see this happening a lot in terms of abuse, of these narratives of like, why did you stay? Why you're a part of this too? You know, it takes two to tango. When you're in an abusive situation, all of the rational thought kind of goes out the window because you're just thinking about survival. Again, one of the first articles I read when I first started studying this in college 20 years ago was a study out of New York that said that 60% of women who are murdered by current or former partners. We are talking about life and death. And when you are in that kind of struggle, you're trying to do the calculus of like what you can do to survive. And again, when police, when judicial systems are not quick to act, when they're quick to minimize, when they're quick to dismiss, how could you make a rational situation in that? Especially if there also aren't social organizations that can support victims of domestic violence. There are some, but again, these private organizations, these nonprofit organizations can only do so much.
One of the things that Mr. Carlisle uncovered in his reporting was that the charges leveled against Mr. Marks, domestic violence related charges, have been going on in the court system for years. Continuances, failure to appear. Mr. Carlisle reported that in one instance, he discovered that Mr. Marks was accused of violating a protection order, and the Salt Lake City Police Department, I believe it was, but at any rate, law enforcement officers visited him about this. And as I understand it from the video report that I will link in this video description, law enforcement opted to take no action. Now, it's my understanding, Vanessa, that a higher percentage of law enforcement officers get involved in domestic violence themselves and in their households than the general population. That has to factor here, right? When we're asking them to review and handle domestic violence cases.
100%, 100%. I did want to bring this up about the statistics that we have, the 40%. That's one self-report study. A lot of the studies that we do have about domestic violence perpetrated by law enforcement, a lot of these studies come out of the 90s. But the studies are anywhere from, you know, a couple percent to 28% to 40%. Nationwide, I think it's 10% of relationships, there's some sort of domestic violence. And yes, of course, when, again, the work that I was doing with the professor at DePaul, it was looking at denial and minimization in domestic violence perpetrators. And there, again, part of the mechanism is denying and minimizing the violence that they are perpetrating. So it, of course, if they're in a situation where somebody is being accused of domestic violence, if they're minimizing and denying their own actions, it's very easy for them to just think it can't be that bad. It's not a problem. If it were bad, she'd leave, right? Or what is she doing to instigate these problems? So it's incredibly dangerous because women are at risk. And the crimes are being taken seriously by the people who are supposed to be, who are supposed to be upholding the law, right? There are certain protections that are supposed to be in place. Again, these protective orders, they exist to save people's lives. And if they're not being enforced, what happens? Women end up dead. So it's very frustrating to look at this court system and to look at a judicial system that is, again, minimizing and ignoring or denying and minimizing what's happening in the public.
Sure, sure. And courts are bogged down with all kinds of violent offenders. Um, we've got the whole issue of privatization and jails and the whole judicial system and the correction system. That's a whole nother can of worms. That there's arguably nowhere to put people. There's just all kinds of issues with this. Another that comes to mind is, are prosecutors, police officers, attorneys, judges, the whole system, are they becoming desensitized to violent offenders when they are just seeing horrific crimes on a daily basis? Are detectives are visiting the sites and literally detecting and inspecting these gruesome sites. Judges are hearing the details, prosecutors are reporting the details. How desensitized do they get to men and women fighting in their homes? As important as that is, this has to factor too, does it not, to some extent?
I would think it does. I mean, I feel like, I mean, again, I was a sickly kid, but I feel like if any, most people have visited a doctor or like gone to an ER and they think they're dying and they're like what you're experiencing feels very serious, but compared to what they see on a daily basis, they minimize it. They're like, whatever, you're fine. Here's an aspirin and, pay me $1,000. You're fine. Go home. So that I think definitely can factor in just the fatigue. There's actually a great book called Trauma Stewardship that talks about what happens when you are somebody who deals with traumatized populations on a regular basis and how you experience vicarious trauma because of that. And the steps that you need to take in order to better support yourself so that you can be a better advocate, you can continue doing your job effectively. But when I look at this, I think about the difference between how domestic violence cases are treated as opposed to, say, violence against children or child murders or other unspeakable things.
Yeah,
It
there's a
feels like,
stigma. Yeah.
yeah, that's it. Like the vigilance for kids is still there because, again, kids are seen as innocent, that they need to be protected. It feels like for a lot of people, if you experience domestic violence, there's this stain on you because it's seen as your fault. Again, why did you stay? Why did you put up with that? Why did you let things go as far as they did? And not understanding the mechanisms of abuse and how somebody gets to that point in the first place, right? Again, it's very rare that a partnership starts with physical violence. It's usually some sort of love bombing first, and then emotional abuse, then to physical abuse and or sexual violence. And because it started out with initial appearances, overtures of care and concern, the person in that situation is constantly looking back and thinking, well, how do I get back there? Well, what happened? How can I fix this? Again, there's something in just human psychology in general where your first impressions are the lasting impressions. And even if it changes dramatically, you're still thinking of that person based off of who you first met them as and how they initially presented themselves as. So I think we can talk in terms of fatigue, but I really think it's so much as stigma. Like I said, this idea of stain. Again, who gets grace, right? Who gets the benefit of the doubt in situations like that? Who is seen worthy of a life free of violence, free of fear? And I think in a lot of cases, in these DV cases, it's just discardable. Essentially, these women are it just in the trash. It's fine.
So we kind of have a couple of different problems, a lot, but at least two with the authority figures. That one, they're either domestic abusers themselves and minimize the circumstances, or two, they don't really understand that these are who kill their wives. wives. These men are who kill their wives, and this isn't something to just shrug off.
And not just their wives. Because a lot of my research is about 20 years old, so I did some digging ahead of today. There was an article in a journal called Injury Epidemiology in 2021, and they were looking at mass shootings between 2014 and 2019 to see the correlation with mass shooters and domestic violence. And they found that the role of domestic violence in fatal mass shootings, and that's 4 or more people who were murdered in the United States, they found that 59.1% of mass shootings were domestic violence related. And in 68.2% of mass shootings, the perpetrator either killed at least one partner or family member or had a history of domestic violence. So this is a systemic issue that ultimately affects all of us. It's not just a partner. It's not just a couple or private affair, a relationship squabble. This, once it explodes, spills over and creates terror for everyone.
Absolutely. Harm family members, co-workers. Yeah, I could absolutely see how that happens. Yes. Um, let's talk about, is anyone proposing solutions? Like I remember there was a culture for a while that Mothers Against Drunk Driving became a really prominent player in the court system and in trying to lobby law enforcement. And while there was nowhere to put people, they didn't want to just, without death being involved, they didn't want to put away drunk drivers for decades at a time. But they did start hitting them in their wallet pretty hard. And they made it real inconvenient to drink and drive. And to the best of my knowledge, that has curbed it quite a bit, or at least it seems so. Are there any solutions being proposed? Are there any penalties that can just make it more trouble than it's worth to act out against one's partner?
So again, there are organizations like the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence that have been doing work for decades, but I haven't heard of anything recently like what you said with Mothers Against Drunk Driving about pushing these penalties. There were several years ago, again, the mandatory reporting laws. So if police and these are still up in several states, that if the police have been called for domestic violence, someone is getting arrested that night. And sometimes it's both partners. And so that creates its own legal issue where the victim as well as the perpetrator are being taken to jail. I think there won't be a call for something like drunk driving penalties because, again, people who die in those car accidents as the result of a drunk driver are seen as innocent. And I think that unless there is a sea change in the way that we look at the survivors of domestic violence, there isn't going to be the same kind of call. There isn't going to be the same kind of rallying cry around protecting them. Because again, the narrative is, it's your fault. You had a part to play in this. So yeah, I haven't heard anything. I'm willing to look though to see if there's something, hopefully there's something brewing.
Sure. I have noticed that a lot, and I've kind of, gotten an education in some of this over the last year or two now. And I've noticed that stigma and a tendency of people to seem to want to compartmentalize different parts of the victim's life into different areas, and that they'll accept them in one way and but not in another. And I found it very beneficial to speak with you and to listen to advocates like Amy Schwartz that Erica Lukes interviewed. I found that very helpful to hear some more of this. Like, one of the things that became clear to me was that of the things that the victim puts in a police report and discusses publicly, there's a really good chance that that's just a minimal part of what has been going on. And I can understand the mentality behind that, that they only want to actually make accusations about what they can show. They know there's a stigma. They don't want to be seen as someone that's just trying to stir up trouble or whatever. And it's embarrassing too. Like, I mean, it's
Oh yeah.
painful when we're traumatized. We don't want to just get on the internet and explain our trauma to a webcam, typically. And so I could understand that there's often a lot more that actually takes place than you'll see in the police report or the court records.
Mhm.
What are we going to do? What can we do as a society, Vanessa, when basically what we're talking about here is that when people get tired of dialogue, they just hit people. You know, what are we going to do as a culture about such circumstances?
I mean, again, I always think of things in terms of systems. I think of things in structures, and we need to start looking at, again, the structures of how we talk about violence. Like I said, with these mass shooting connections with domestic violence, different types of violence, different types of structural violence inform and reinforce each other. So once you start pulling the thread on one, you have to see all the other ones it's connected to, and you have to be willing to follow that through to its logical conclusion about what needs to be changed, what needs to be reformed, what needs to be tossed out. I always want to see, again, so much of what people are expected to do in terms of like politics is just vote, right? Vote in better candidates. How about run for city legislature, like run for local, run for school boards, do what you can on the local level, get involved, get invested, because these changes happen when passionate people actually take the effort to make them happen. You can shout on the internet as much as you want, and you can do some sort of information distribution that way if you're an effective communicator. But really, if you want to see policy changes, you actually have to get your hands in the dirt and start doing something, especially when the system is built in such a way to, like I said, deny, minimize, deflect, bury. A lot has to change. I don't think it's impossible. I'm very much an idealist, even though I am typically pretty pessimistic online. But it takes work. It takes work. It takes a concerted effort over a long period of time to make appreciable changes in people's lives. But it's worthwhile work so that women don't have to suffer, that people don't have to suffer, that they don't have to struggle in abusive relationships and then worry that once they finally come forward, that they're not going to be listened to, that the crimes aren't going to be prosecuted. Like you said, with evidence. I mean, imagine if somebody is hitting you and you have to try to think in the moment, I better try to get photographs of this so I can take this to court. And even then, is it going to be minimized in some way? Are they going to say, well, she got those bruises, but it was some other thing? There's so much that needs to be done. I think it's possible. It's just people really have to get invested in seeing change and not give up their agency to saying, well, this is how things are. There's nothing we can do. There's a lot that people can do.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Are there any other issues you would particularly like to touch on or bring to people's attention related to this today?
There was a story that I had seen recently out of Alaska, which again, I think highlights all of the different structural issues that are at play with this, where there were two different women who were found dead on a former mayor's property. Both of these women had been either current or former partners of the mayor's sons. It happened 2 years apart. and neither the police actually ruled them as suicides, and they did no investigation. They didn't push it at all. Both of the sons have histories of domestic violence, that the mayor himself had a history of domestic violence, and it all got swept under the rug. And those two women too, they're Nunpiak, they're indigenous. And that gets into these structural issues too. Who gets seen as a person, who gets the grace of being a human being, and who doesn't. So when you're a woman and you're indigenous, you're disposable. So again, this is happening everywhere. And again, people really need to be paying attention, and doing what they can to stop it, to fight it. Sure, you can make a donation to a domestic violence organization, or you can volunteer. Or like I said, you can get on a city board, become an alderman, do that work to try to make actual change in your neighborhood.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I've noticed in my own path with this that sometimes I will avert from the issues, and I like to think I have some skill at looking inward, and instead of pointing fingers, asking myself, what's up with that. And it challenges us to address our own trauma. When we find ourselves not wanting to give other people space, not wanting to allow other people to discuss their pain. Granted, we're not always going to be, up for it, but typically speaking, if we avert from that and we would prefer to oppress people speaking their truth, I think it says something about our aversion to our pain, that we don't have space for others. And so I really appreciate you addressing this stuff, Vanessa, helping me create this space that Expanding Frontiers would like to help create the space for people to address the things that are important to them and important to us as a culture. And sometimes that can get ugly and messy, and that has to be okay, because that's just the reality of the situation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So again, thank you very much for joining me. I really appreciate it. And be sure and look for Vanessa. She's a successful podcaster. She does all kinds of neat stuff around on the internet. And thank you for being here, Vanessa.
Thank you again for having me.
Absolutely.